Howdy everyone, and welcome back to this tutorial series. So far we have created our content model. We have created the entities, the content types, and we have populated those with some content. Okay, now we are ready to start fetching those data from our Next.js application and creating our React components, our Next.js pages. Okay, but before we can do any of these, we first need to communicate with Contentful, and for that we need a Contentful client. So that's what we're gonna do in this tutorial, and the first thing for that is to install the npm Contentful package. So I'm gonna install that right now. Npm I Contentful. You see now we have Contentful added here to this dependencies. Okay, so now that you have this, let's do a bit of scaffolding. You know me, I like to have my code very modular, so we're gonna create a folder called data layer, which is basically gonna be responsible for fetching for the data layer, like the name suggests, of our application. And within that folder, because my goal behind this tutorial is that at some point we're gonna also add tutorials for other CMS like Prismic, Sanity, Strapi, and so I'm gonna create a subfolder inside called Contentful. Okay, and within that folder I'm gonna finally create the Contentful client. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so now if we jump inside of this folder, what do we want to do? We want to import a function from the npm package that we just installed, which is create client. Okay, create client. Let's do it like this. I think it's not the default import. Create client from Contentful. Contentful, voila. And we want to export the client. Export const client equals create client. Okay, and what this object needs, three main in order to instantiate the Contentful client, we need to pass three main things. The space. Okay, we're gonna come back to the value where we get that value later on. Access token, that's the next thing, very important. That's how you authenticate with the Contentful backend. And the environment. Okay, the environment. All right, so these are the three main things that we need in order to instantiate a Contentful client. Where do we get those values and what are they? Okay, so let's go to Contentful here. First of all, if you look at the Contentful documentation, as you can see here, we need the space, the access token, and the environment. What are these? Very quickly, very briefly, the way data is organized in Contentful is they have this. You have this very nice hierarchy. You have organizations, and then within an organization you have different spaces, and within and for each space you can have different environments. And if you're familiar with GitHub or Git in general, an environment is basically like a branch. It's a branch. It's basically, you can version the space, so you can have version 1 of your space, and when the data evolve and the requirement of your business change, you can create a different environment and then model the data, a different environment, which is a different version of a given space, and model the data to capture the changes in your business requirements. Okay, so you can see that all our content type and our content lives within a specific space. Okay, and that's what Contentful is asking us here. What is the space for which we want to create this particular client? Because the data that we're going to fetch are relevant for a specific space and only one space. Okay, so where do we get that? All right, so you come here to your Contentful account, you go to API keys. You can see I've already created one here, but just for the sake of this demo, let's try to create one. Okay, so Contentful tutorials, you're gonna get a new space ID here. If this is the first time, you get fetch the space ID here, and you're gonna add it here. Okay, and then we're gonna do the same thing. The content delivery API, if I come again to the Contentful documentation, you will see that they have multiple. Let me reduce this a little bit. You see that they have multiple like they have multiple APIs for different purposes. The content delivery API is the one that is more appropriate when you're fetching data. The Contentful management API is the one that is more appropriate when you're creating or updating data. And if you're a fan of GraphQL, you can use the GraphQL content API as well. Okay, so for this video, for this tutorial, we're going to use the content delivery API, and that's the access token here for the content delivery API. So I'm going to fetch this and add this here, and don't use this. By the time you see this video, this is going to be gone. And finally, the environment. Like I said, the environment is basically like a versioning of your space, and by default, Contentful uses the master. Gives the name master. Okay, if you don't create one is created. If you don't, when you create an API key or a space, the master environment is created by default. So we're gonna add here master. Okay, and when you do this, once you do this, you are basically ready to go. You have created a Contentful client. But there's a big issue with this, is that these data are meant to be private. Okay, and as you can see here, and even VS Code is already telling you this is a file that is tracked by Git. Okay, so that means if we git commit this is now going to be part of our Git history, and everyone who has access to our code can see that and have access to our Contentful account, which obviously we don't want. Okay, so in order to solve that, we can use environment variables. Okay, to we can store these values within environment variables, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So for the sake of this video, my environment variables, my actual environment variables are within this env.local file, and so if you follow along with me, create a file called .env.local. Okay, but for the sake of this video, because I don't want to open this file, I'm going to do the same thing that you should be doing in this env.local in this other file. Okay, so what you want to do is just go here, whatever it is that we have copied, you just put it here like this. You see Contentful space ID, and then this is other value here, you put it here. Okay, you change this, you put this here, and then environment and master, you put it here. And then what you do is to do this very simply, process.env, okay, Contentful space ID. Okay, and next thing you do is process .env Contentful delivery API token, and finally Contentful environment. All right, and then once you do that, you have a very clean code with everything that you need to be able to fetch the data from Contentful. Okay, so that's the first step. Now that we have our Contentful client, let's try to fetch some data. Okay, and for that we are gonna create another file. I would like to keep things very modular, like you know. Gonna create a file called company. Okay, and here we're gonna fetch you remember our model, we have company and we have jobs. Okay, so we're gonna fetch all the companies within our space, and the way we do that, let's import the client that we just created. Okay, import client. Okay, and that what we do, export get const get companies equals async. This is an asynchronous function because we're going to be talking to an API. Okay, and then we do const companies equals await get client get entries. And the way you fetch data with the content delivery API in Contentful is that you need to pass in the content type for which you're fetching the data. In this case, you're fetching the company. Okay, and how do we spell? Like, you need to pass in, when you're fetching, the ID of the content type, which is basically company, the same thing but with lowercase. Okay, and this is going to retrieve all the companies, maybe with some paginations, maybe like the first hundreds, depending on the default data in Contentful. And then we're going to return, okay, companies dot items. For the sake of this demo, later on we're going to do some cleaning of the data that are being returned by Contentful by default. We're going to do some cleaning, especially when we're going to be retrieving the jobs. We're going to do some cleaning. Okay, so this is how you fetch data from Contentful. So very quickly, let's test that by doing a console log in our index.js. So if you look at our index.js so far, we are not, if I refresh this page, we are not logging anything. Okay, there's nothing being logged so far. So let's go in the index.js and import that here. Do an import companies, get companies. Okay, all right, from Contentful. All right, and we want to do a very simple get static props. Okay, get static props. I have this extension in VS Code that create the boilerplate for me. So I'm going to get companies equals to await get companies. All right, very good. And I'm just going to return it here very simply like this. And finally, I'm going to add this as a prop. Oops. Add this as a prop here like this. Oh no, okay. And finally, I'm gonna log like this. Okay, companies, and let's see. All right, let's see what's going on. I'm sure there's gonna be a bug, and I'm gonna explain to you what the bug. Okay, everything is good. You see here we have all right, you see these are all the companies that are within our space, right? All the companies that are within our space. We have, if you come back here to the content model and close these other pages, come here to content. If I filter by company, you see that we have 3 companies: Revolut, Contentful Inc., and Lifted Ventures Limited. These are the 3 companies that have been returned here. You see Revolut, Contentful Inc., and Lifted Ventures Limited. All of the companies are there. You have the fields, the city, cover image, and so on and so forth. So we are good. We are fetching the data successfully. But before closing this video, I want to say a few things. This code is great, but there's a but. I would like I said, this tutorial is meant to be one that we are gonna at some point we want to switch at some point the data layer and use, let's say, Strapi or Sanity. It will be a lot of work to go and find each individual pages of our application and change the data layer. I want the data layer to be the presentation layer to be completely agnostic of the CMS that you're using under the hood. Okay, and this is going to be a recurring theme throughout this tutorial series. We are going to do things having in mind that we are working in such a way that switching the data, switching the data layer is a very simple process. Okay, so we want to be in a position where we can simply do data layer, import get companies, import from data layer, and that's it. Okay, we don't have to tell that we are doing it from Contentful or whatever. Okay, so that's what I want to do here. And in order to do that, it's very simple. We are going to create a file called index.js within the data layer. Okay, index.js. All right, and the way to do that, okay, we are going to export the functions that are relevant to us. In this case, get companies. Okay, I'd like to have it in one step like this. Okay, very simple. Okay, export get companies from Contentful company. Okay, and what we're going to do is replace here the import. We're going to import get companies from the data layer, right? That's it, right? That's the first thing. And if I go here and refresh, say it still works very fine. We have changed the import, we have changed the import, and now we import. You see now that our code is completely irrelevant which data layer we are using. So later on, if we change the data layer and we use, let's say, Prismic or Sanity or Strapi, we just have one file to change and everything else remains the same, right? So that's the goal behind this little change. And finally, one final thing that is very important to do is to understand that we don't want, these are very important and critical data that we don't want anyone to have access to. So usually, in this particular case, it's not necessarily how to put this. It's not happening yet because in indexed the way we are fetching it in the pages, this code is going to run on the server, okay? But still, you never want to be in a position where this code is going to run on a client, and at the moment, nothing prevents this code from running on a client, right? So what we want to do is to add some extra layer of security and make sure that this code for retrieving the client only runs when we are on the server, and that's what we're going to do by adding what we call a factory function that's going to be protected by this utility function that's called isServer. I'm going to pass this here, but basically this function is going to return true or false depending on whether we are running on the client or on the server. And when we're on the client, window document is going to be an actual value, and also window is going to be different to the undefined type. Okay, so what we want to do is create a function called const server only create client, okay, which is going to be basically a very simple factory function that we're going to use, and we're going to test if isServer, okay. If it's server, if it's not server, sorry, we return. Otherwise, we simply do what you're doing here, okay. We call this like this, x const client, and then we're going to return this, then client, okay. And now what we do is client export const client equals to server only client, right? We make sure that this code is never going to run anywhere else but on the server, right? And with that, we have reached the, I hope you understand what we're doing here. Basically, we are forcing this function. If I try to import the client on the server, it's never going to work because we are making sure that we are only creating it once when we are on the server side, okay? And with that, we have reached the end of this tutorial. I hope you learned something new. In the next video, we're going to actually start creating, now that we are able to consume data from Contentful very successfully, we're going to create the actual listings to list the jobs, and we're going to see that in the next video. Thank you all for watching, and see you.